Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Koornacht Cluster in the 6th Black Sword Command. The Koornacht Cluster continues a fun trend for Black Sword Command in that it is mainly notable for an event that probably happened but we don't know. See, Black Sword Command is the region of space colloquially known as the Negs, which is a thorny nest of gravity wells and hyperspace anomalies which has made it really inconvenient to navigate. There's so many uninhabited or barely inhabited planets already that for most of Republic history, it's been ignored. But here's the thing. While you can live on Dagobah, nobody wants to. So after all your halfway decent Outer Rim planets like Plazier 15 or even Navarro are spoken for, when you've reached the stage of galactic colonization where people are building cities over Tibanna giants like Bespin, you start picking your way through the thicket looking for new planets because, yeah, we've got millions of empty planets with breathable atmosphere to colonize, if you want to live on Dagobah, but nobody does. And then, in the middle of that, Chief Palpatine disbands the Senate and abolishes the galactic bureaucracy. Now, nobody is keeping track of anything. Hyperspace fuel cores are a thin shell of real fuel around a non-reactive rock, so you've got less than half as much in your reactor as you thought. Burger joints on Coruscant start selling corpse starch from the lower levels mislabeled as Nerf meat, and nobody is keeping any record of anything. Like a week later, the Death Star gets blown up by a single pilot and the old war serial propaganda engine from the Clone Wars revs back to life. Except now, rebel propagandists from the Outer Rim are distributing their own serials through the HoloNet, and Red 5 is a way more compelling hero than anyone the Empire can trot out or make up. After the war ends, Mon Mothma and the other victorious rebels start rebuilding the bureaucracy for the New Republic, but the hyperfuel fraud and the cannibal burgers take precedent over historical records, so we have this period of years and years where our main source for what's going on are all those propaganda serial writers, both Imperial guys on Coruscant who flip to the New Republic after the war, and old rebels from the Outer Rim who start cashing in on the fame they got writing from the underground during the war. And these guys write about something called the Black Fleet Crisis, and I have not been able to find a single trustworthy source that's ever sat down with Leia Organa to ask if any of it actually happened. The timeline works out. It's relatively soon after the end of the war, when Luke, Leia, Han, and Lando, the protagonists, were still pretty active in galactic affairs. The crisis is allegedly caused by a hostile alien empire capturing a bunch of Imperial weapons during the final collapse of the Empire and going on a rampage. And I know most alien invasion serials are blatantly fictitious, most famously the Yuuzhan Vong stories, but as a crisis impacting just a few sectors on the fringe of unknown space, this one is totally plausible. It was also published before those Yuuzhan Vong stories, so it might plausibly have inspired them. And also, the Black Fleet Crisis books are just generally really grounded. I don't want to oversell them, they're not top-tier fiction, and I also do want to highlight that while they purport to be based on a true story, they are marketed as fiction. But still, they don't claim that there was a secret backup empire in unknown space that had another 15 Death Stars or something crazy like that. None of what's described in them is unbelievable, but none of it is verified either, so grain of salt. Okay, so what are the details of this alleged Black Fleet crisis? After running away from the Battle of Endor, Death Squadron calls for backup to face the incoming Rebel fleet at what will eventually be the Battle of Jakku. Over-sector fleets in and around the core world, like 1st Azure Hammer and 6th Black Sword, have always been used as reserve fleets. Like, sure, they're hypothetically supposed to be the first responders if their over-sectors ever face an uprising, but they never do, so mostly they send reinforcements to more active theaters. Black Sword mostly flung Star Destroyers out into the unknown regions looking for a fight to pick while waiting for someone to call them up for reinforcements in the mid-rim offensive, or, in this case, the Battle of Jakku. The Rebel army still hasn't recovered from the mid-rim offensive, but their fleet is blazing hot, so Black Sword sends their most powerful ships off, but leaves most of their ground weapons behind with a skeleton fleet as a last line of defense. And then the Rebels win the Battle of Jakku, leaving pretty much every functional Star Destroyer previously stationed in 6th Black Sword as a ruin in the sand to be picked over by scavengers for the next 30 years. They leave behind Black 15, a shipyard used to build and maintain Star Destroyers, in orbit over N'Zoth, a planet in the Koornacht Cluster first discovered in the Imperial era along with several other planets colonized by the Yavetha species. Because of how tangled the Negs are, the Yavetha had never made it out of the Koornacht Cluster or even met the other species of the cluster, so their first contact was getting enslaved by the Imperials. No standing in the Imperial Senate and being in a very difficult to reach part of the galaxy meant that, even though it's technically a core world, the Empire was able to enslave the Yavetha with impunity. 15 shipyard has a bunch of Star Destroyers that were docked for repairs and weren't ready for immediate deployment when the call went out to confront the rebels at Jakku. It's also got a bunch of heavy weapons that were left behind by the functional Star Destroyers because the Imperials did not anticipate the rebels giving them much trouble on the ground after their performance on Hoth. On the planet below are the Avatha, a species whose society was built around an obsession with death. That wasn't as bad as it sounded. In the Republic days, after 15 years of Imperial oppression, the Avatha went from just kinda super goth to being an insane death cult. As part of an early stage of Operation Cinder, the Imperials at Black 15 were going to execute all the dockwalkers, bombard the planet with every functional turbo laser, and then lob the shipyard and every Star Destroyer that wasn't spaceworthy at the biggest population centers on the planet. The Avatha caught wind of it, overpowered the Imperials, and seized the weapons for themselves. Now, the timeline after this doesn't fully make sense, so the writers of the books were clearly forced to, at minimum, invent some details which they failed to double-check. They claimed that Leia Organa was Supreme Chancellor when the Avatha finished consolidating control over Black 15 and attacked the Koornacht Cluster at large. Leia Organa's candidacy was famously unable to escape the allegations that Anakin Skywalker, her father, had been the true identity of Darth Vader, which means she was Darth Vader's secret heir. The Papanoida films unfailingly paint Leia in a heroic light to the point of being propagandistic, but they also pushed this theory, and it probably tanked Leia's shot at the Chancellorship. In Baron Papanoida's defense, for all that he used music and narrative focus to frame the Rebel Alliance in the most positive possible light, he was really thorough about sticking to well-vetted sources and depicting events that really happened. And the historical reality is that there's only like 6 guys who could plausibly have been Darth Vader's true identity, and Anakin Skywalker is easily the most plausible suspect. I bring that up to say that this story claims that Leia Organa was Supreme Chancellor of the New Republic during this Koornacht crisis, and while getting the timeline wrong is a pretty common mistake for historical fiction serials like this one, Leia was never Supreme Chancellor, which makes me suspect that this might have actually been a 20 minutes in the future style crisis, anticipating an Organa chancellorship that never happened. But it might have also been someone with bad holonet access who misunderstood Leia Organa's position in the New Republic. And someone with bad holonet access would make sense for a guy posting serial fiction who actually lived in the Negs, because serial fiction writers don't get paid a lot, but cost of living in the Negs isn't that high, so that kind of cancels out. And also, even if you're on the kind of holonet connection where it takes 45 minutes to upload 30 pages of text, and actual holovids are so beyond the pale of possibility that it isn't really the holonet, just like the net. But you can still upload weekly chapters just fine on that kind of connection. Anyway, the new Yavatha government was, according to these serials, called the Dushkan League. They consolidated control over about a dozen primarily Yavatha worlds in the Koornacht Cluster, with annoying names like which I assume is easier to pronounce if you're Yavatha. They were in talks with the New Republic to join as a sector. But here's the problem. The Koornacht Cluster actually crosses over 2 sectors, Farlax and Hatawa, which are the traditional domain of the Khorazg and the Norad sovereignty. I think that's respective, but I don't actually know. But Chamomile, I hear you ask, the New Republic bureaucracy is mostly rebuilt now. Surely you know the current status of the Farlax and Hatawa sectors, and yes, I do. We'll get back to that. One New Republic record that did survive is that in the Farlax sector is the planet Galantos, which is covered in jello. Not literally, obviously. The seas are gelatinous, and the solid islands drift around on them unmoored from the crest, drifting slowly through the gelatinous oceans. And they're sufficiently unstable that the inhabitants mostly live in cities that float in hot air balloons. This has nothing to do with the Black Fleet crisis, but it's in the Farlax sector, and I thought it was cool. Anyway, the New Republic is having a classic Republic crisis because the Dushkan League wants to bite some of both Farlax and Hatawa off to make their own sector, and neither the Khorazg nor the Norad sovereignty like that. Plus, there's arguments about exactly where the line should go, and at some point, the Dushkan League just starts killing everyone else in the cluster to achieve total military domination. According to the books, this was always the plan, although if my theory about the author being native to the Negs is correct, they're probably biased, and it might have been the Yavatha growing impatient that the New Republic Senate was debating and committeeing and not actually getting anything done. Back on the first hand, the fact that genocide was the Yavatha's plan B is sufficiently fucked up that it doesn't really stretch belief much to think that maybe that was their plan A and the overtures to the New Republic were just a ploy to win themselves some supporters in the Senate, who would then express skepticism of Yavatha atrocities and stall a New Republic response. Either way, the Dutch-Can League succeeds in their goal of clearing out the Koornacht and the NORAD sovereignty, which is why checking the current New Republic records for who had which sector doesn't produce any results. They're both generic colonial democratic sectors now because the original government and traditions were wiped out by Yavetha invaders. The New Republic did eventually send a response force to scout out what was going on and protect the Koornacht and the NORAD, and they discovered that after seizing all the Imperial weapons, the Yavetha had indeed decided to use that material to basically pick up Operation Cinder where it left off, just with themselves as the stormtroopers this time. Oh, and do you know what kind of starship has such heinous maintenance requirements that it spends like 80% of its time in a shipyard? The kind that, no matter how useful it would have been at Jakku, had pretty low odds of being ready for immediate deployment in response to a sudden rebel incursion. A ship that, nevertheless, would be really useful for an army on the attack, who can build the go date of their genocide plans around whenever the ship is available, even if that's a narrow window of time. Yeah, the Yavetha had a Super Star Destroyer. The Republic's X-Wing Ranger Squad didn't stand a chance, but when the survivors brought back word of what was going on, the New Republic finally took some action. Fortunately, the Rebel fleet wasn't fully decommissioned at this point, and the Yavetha had failed to learn from the mistake the Empire had made that allowed them to rise up and form the Dutch-Can League in the first place. That the Star Destroyers, and especially the Super Star Destroyer, were such massive resource hogs that they were impossible to maintain. The New Republic fleet was way below what a galaxy-spanning nation should have been able to field, but they still pretty well crushed the Yavetha because the Yavetha's fleet was barely functional. The Koornacht Cluster just didn't have the resources needed to refuel and rearm the Imperial fleet stationed in it. So, once the Yavetha had expended a bunch of fuel and ammo in their initial conquest, half their fleet was inoperable when the New Republic showed up with a Mon Cal cruiser and 100 X-Wing pilots who couldn't wait to tell cheering throngs on Coruscant about how they were the ones who fired the proton torpedoes that destroyed the last Super Star Destroyer and saved the galaxy. As hard fought as that battle was, though, it didn't actually require the New Republic to mobilize. They fished around their junk drawer for whatever warships they still had lying around from the last war, flung it at the problem, and they won. It worked. I'm still not 100% that the Black Fleet crisis even happened, but I'll tell you this much, it fits perfectly with the direction the galaxy was going at the time. The New Republic was cocky as fuck about not needing a real fleet anymore, and successfully defending a sector, however belatedly, from a bloodthirsty horde of aliens and Star Destroyers would probably contribute to that hubris. You can draw a pretty straight line from here to the point when Imperial remnants in the Outer Rim started consolidating into the First Order.